Hi, so in this video I'm going to review transport of carbon dioxide. So what we have to know from the specification is hemoglobin's role in transporting carbon dioxide, and we're going to look at where carbonic anhydrase fits in, so that's the name of an enzyme. We're going to look at what hemoglobinic acid is, and we're going to look at the importance of bicarbonate ions and the chloride shift. So that's your statement from the specification. So if we think about carbon dioxide, it's got to be moved from where it's produced in the respiring tissues as a result of cellular respiration to the point of the body where it's removed, which is from the gas exchange surface. So don't forget, it diffuses from the blood into the alveoli and we exhale it out. Now, CO2 can be transported in 3 different ways. About 5% of it is in solution in the plasma, so in the liquid part of the blood. So it's produced by respiring tissues, diffuses into the plasma, excuse me, dissolves in the contents of the plasma and is transported that way. About 10% actually moves into the red blood cells, into the erythrocytes, and it binds with hemoglobin to form this substance called carbaminohemoglobin. And then the other proportion of CO2, the vast majority of it, is as hydrogen carbonate ions. So that's what we're going to look at. Now, these figures that you see here will vary slightly when you look at different texts, but they're like to give you an overall impression. So when we, so that's just for you to pause the video and you can make some notes. That just sort of summarises what we've talked about. When we look at transport of CO2, sometimes it's useful to look at it in the form of a diagram. Now, I know this looks overly complicated, but this is what I'm going to try and talk you through. So at the top, we've got the cells. This could be any tissue in your body, okay? And these cells here, when they're carrying out aerobic respiration, they're going to produce CO2, and that CO2 is going to diffuse out of the cells into the tissue fluid surrounding those cells, and then it's going to diffuse across the endothelial wall of the blood capillaries and into the blood. So the bottom portion of this diagram just represents the blood. All of the white area would be the plasma, and then here we've got an erythrocyte. So this funny shape here, this biconcave disc sliced through, is a red blood cell. Now, as we've said before, some of the CO2 simply dissolves in the plasma and that's how it's carried. The remaining part of the carbon dioxide diffuses into the red blood cells, okay? And as it diffuses into the red blood cells, it can follow one of 2 routes, okay? If we take this route first, some of the CO2 that diffuses in binds with this molecule here, okay? Hemoglobin, it's actually, and we'll talk about what this H is shortly, but it binds with this hemoglobin here, and it binds directly to the hemoglobin molecule. And so some of that CO2 is carried attached to the hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin, okay? The other CO2 that's diffused into the erythrocyte actually results in the formation of these hydrogen carbonate ions down here, or these bicarbonate ions. And this is how some, or the remaining bigger proportion of the CO2 is carried as hydrogen carbonate ions. And what we can see happening is that the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the erythrocyte, and we're going to get a reaction that results in this formation here. Now, what happens is the carbon dioxide is going to react with water to form this compound here. Let's just put those up, okay? And this compound here is carbonic acid, okay, H2CO3. That carbonic acid quickly dissociates to form hydrogen ions, or protons, H+, and HCO3- or bicarbonate ions. This whole reaction here between the CO2 and water to form carbonic acid, and then which then dissociates to form hydrogen carbonate ions and bicarbonate ions, is all catalyzed by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. Now, this reaction here would happen naturally, but in the presence of this enzyme here, it's going to make it occur really quickly. What then happens is the hydrogen carbonate ions then diffuse out the erythrocytes and into the plasma, and that's how they're then going to be transported in the blood within the plasma. And to maintain the kind of electrical neutrality of this blood cell here, chloride ions, which have the same charge, diffuse back in the opposite direction. So we have what's called a chloride shift. The hydrogen carbonate ion come out here, the chloride ions diffuse back in the opposite direction. And that just keeps, if you've lost a negatively charged ion, you want to put a negatively charged ion back in the opposite direction. So that's when we talk about 85% of the carbon dioxide being transported as hydrogen carbonate ions. That's how it happens. The other thing that this is really important for, so not just for CO2 transport, is the fact that these hydrogen ions that are produced when this H2, this carbonic acid splits up, H2CO3 splits up, these hydrogen ions here, or protons, as they can also be called, bind to oxyhemoglobin. Remember, HbO2 is oxyhemoglobin. What we can see here, the hydrogen ions have bound to that oxyhemoglobin, and as they bind, that lower pH that's existing causes the oxyhemoglobin to unload its oxygen, give up its oxygen, and that oxygen can then leave the erythrocyte by diffusion and diffuse into the respiring tissues. So if you think about it, that's a brilliant situation. A tissue that's doing lots of cellular respiration and is going to need more oxygen because it's doing lots of cellular respiration, it produces CO2. The CO2 diffuses into the erythrocyte and ultimately, by a little indirect pathway, causes the oxygen carrying molecule to then let go of its oxygen. The oxygen's unloaded into the plasma and then into the cells here, and we get more oxygen to the cells for respiration. Now, when this hydrogen ion here has basically bound to the hemoglobin and it causes the hemoglobin then to let go of its oxygen, what we then form is this HHB structure here. This is hemoglobinic acid, okay? And basically that hemoglobinic acid is what the carbon dioxide binds onto to form the carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, and we go round in this little cycle to carry the CO2 and cause the oxygen to be unloaded. Now, obviously, the more CO2 we have here, because the tissues are respiring more, then the more of this process here is going to be happening, and therefore the more oxygen is going to be getting released to the tissues. So, you know, when we talked about hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen being affected by the concentration or the partial pressure of oxygen, well, what we can see here is that CO2 concentration definitely affects hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. The more CO2 there is, the higher the concentration or partial pressure of oxygen, the lower the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, because you're going to produce more. You're going to follow this route more, so you're going to produce more of these hydrogen ions or protons, which means that you're going to produce more of the hemoglobinic acid, and that oxygen is going to be released and can diffuse into the tissues. So on this slide here, you can just see, we've just summarised in words what we've talked on pictures, so you can pause that and read it through and make some notes. And then that's just, again, another different way of kind of summarising the reaction. Okay, so it's an overall, shows you carbon dioxide and water, the enzyme catalysing that reaction, and we can get this quick dissociation into these two here. And we know this is going to diffuse out into the plasma, chloride is going to diffuse back in the opposite direction, and then it's this hydrogen ion that's going to affect hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen and give up the oxygen to the respiring tissues. Now, the really important thing about this, and this is where we kind of see represented on graphs when we talked about the Bohr effect, when we looked at oxygen dissociation curves, we know that when tissues are going to be respiring more, and so say you've got a big muscle group doing lots of active contraction, there's going to be lots of cellular respiration going on there, you know that that tissue is going to produce more CO2. So because more CO2 is produced, then you're going to have more hydrogen ions going to be produced, which are going to bind with the hemoglobin to produce your hemoglobinic acid. And therefore that makes hemoglobin have a lower affinity for oxygen, and that oxygen is going to be released to the tissues, which makes it a good thing. Now, that process there, that action of CO2 and what we call the Bohr effect, it still applies even at high partial pressures of oxygen. Okay, so the whole curve, our whole oxygen dissociation curve, shifts to the right-hand side the higher the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So if I show you on the next slide, here we can see 3 different curves. So curve A, the pink one, is at the lowest partial pressure of CO2. The more carbon dioxide that's there, the lower we can see the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen at any partial pressure of oxygen. So we can see that as the higher the concentration of carbon dioxide, we can see the curve continues to shift to the right. Okay, and so that's a really useful thing. We refer to that as the Bohr effect. And it sort of summarizes that relationship between CO2 and hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. That's just another diagram as sort of a slightly different arrangement of the diagram, but it's representing exactly the same process that we saw in the first one. So it's just to get you to kind of think, all right, okay, I can follow it round and I can see the same representation of what's going on, just in a slightly different arrangement. So we can see CO2 diffusing into the plasma, reacting with the water. Remember, that's catalyzed by this enzyme here. That carbonic acid quickly dissociates into our H plus and our HCO3 minus. H3O3 minus are going to diffuse out into the plasma. Cl minus is going to diffuse in the opposite direction, so that's our chloride shift. Remember, that maintains electrical neutrality in the cell. These hydrogen ions here are the ones that are going to make a difference to how much oxygen the hemoglobin is carrying. Because remember, as those hydrogen ions come along, they bind with the hemoglobin and they reduce hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, make it not bound to it so tightly. The oxygen gets released and we form hemoglobinic acid, this one here. Okay, so that's our transport of CO2. Now, in the lungs, obviously we don't want, when our blood gets to the lungs, we don't want lots of our CO2 to be as hydrogen carbonate ions or bicarbonate ions. Remember, those two things are the same. So what we have is the opposite situation. Okay, so basically the hydrogen ions are going to diffuse into the erythrocyte, and when they diffuse into the erythrocyte, they're going to the hydrogen carbonate diffuses into the erythrocyte. It's going to react with the hydrogen ions to form the carbonic acid. This time chloride ions are going to diffuse out to keep it balanced. And then carbonic acid, and this is what I always used to find a bit strange. The carbonic acid is then going to be converted to carbon dioxide and water because of carbonic anhydrase. So it's an enzyme that can catalyze the reaction in both directions, which is a bit unusual from what we're used to. Okay, but it will do it. And so then what happens is, once we form the carbon dioxide and the water, the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse back into the plasma. And because we're always exhaling, if you've got high CO2 in the plasma in the alveolus and lower in the actual alveolus itself, it's going to diffuse out of the plasma into the alveolus and you're going to exhale it. Okay, so now this is another advantage, obviously, because if you're getting rid of that CO2, the pH is going to be raised, and we're not going to have as many hydrogen ions around. And so we're going to actually make sure we've got hemoglobin being there with a higher affinity for oxygen, because we're not going to have as much CO2 around. So our Bohr shift kind of goes in the opposite direction in the lungs. And so that makes it really useful for us. So I hope this has helped you sort of try to get your head around it. What I want you to do is you can pause the video and then send me some emails and say, right, miss, I get what you're saying here, but I don't get what you're saying here, if you just refer to the timings on the video. and then we can then you can ask me for some more help with it. Okay, but I hope doing this has given you a bit of an insight into